Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and this is a quick video in my rune course about the Proto-Norse language. Now, for those who don't have a language or linguistics background or who don't know Old Norse, this might have some slightly impenetrable details, but I hope that it will be interesting even for those without such background. And I'll present more details on the screen that I can really get into in a short video. And of course, there's more details out there. For example, in Michael Schulte's Old Norse, eine Einführung, an introduction to Proto-Norse, which is in German for those who can read that. You can also find good details about Proto-Germanic in books like Don Ringe's From Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic, as you would expect. That assumes some familiarity with Old Indo-European languages. Well, for now, let us just talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of Proto-Norse as a language. So one of the most visible, obvious things that you'll notice in looking at words in Proto-Norse as opposed to Old Norse is they typically have more syllables. There's a lot of apocryphy and syncope, that is, a lot of loss of unstressed syllables in the transition from Proto-Norse to Old Norse. This is very characteristic of Germanic languages, and going from the ancient to medieval periods, they lose unstressed syllables, that is, syllables after the first syllable, because it's always the first syllable stressed in Old Germanic languages unless there is an unstressed prefix. Well, I thought that overlook over Durango would be a better place to film, and then I got everything set up with no one there, and a lot of people showed up. And I never know how to explain what I'm doing to people. So I'll make this another multi-location one, like the new introduction to pronouncing Old Norse from a few months ago. Now, what I was saying about differences between Proto-Norse and Old Norse that are well reflected in our Elder Futhark inscriptions. Proto-Norse words are on the whole almost always longer than their Old Norse descendants. But that doesn't mean that any information is lost in the change from Proto-Norse to Old Norse. Instead, the information is moved earlier in the word. So a good example of this is a word element that we see in many men's names, gastes, in Proto-Norse. This means guest. And you can kind of see from the English descendant of that word, this is no different from what the Proto-Germanic, Proto-English word would be, what I'm talking about. So our Old Norse word is gestar, and what you've got there is apocryphy of the I in the second syllable, bringing us down to what at one point would have been a one-syllable gasts, possibly with voicing assimilation of the Z to the T becoming an S. But before that I apocryphates, use different words, drops, is lost, it mutates the A and the preceding stress syllable into an E. It brings it further forward in the mouth toward the position of the old I. This is so-called I mutation, one of the most characteristic sound changes, both of Old Norse and ultimately of English. So then after the Z becomes an R, we don't exactly know when this happens because they continue to spell the old, the R that comes from a Z differently until after the year 1000. They hold on to this tradition for a long time, so we don't know when this transition happens. You can see that going from gastes to gestar, there are some pretty obvious differences. Different vowel in the first syllable, loss of a vowel in the second, and the change of Z to R all of which perfectly predictable, always going to happen in the transition from Proto-Norse to Old Norse in these circumstances, and the same amount of information is retained, right? The nominative case is marked by the Z in Proto-Norse or by the R that comes from it in Old Norse. The fact that this is an I stem is marked by the I in Proto-Norse, but marked by the mutated A, mutated by an I in Old Norse. So it's, I'm trying to think how to put this well. It's an economy of information between the two stages of the language, but the two stages look impressionistically very different because of exactly these changes: loss of unstressed vowels, mutation of stressed vowels, and the change from Z to R. These are really our key things to look for. We're going to see that in all kinds of names. Again, of course, names are most of what we see in Proto-Norse. Just a few days ago, as I record this, we saw that the earliest known occurrence of the name of the god Odin in writing was announced. This is a cool discovery. We're still waiting for a few more details, but the form of his name on the Bracteate, on which it was found, dating from about the 400s AD in Denmark, is Wothnas. Now that is the genitive singular, the possessive form, the equivalent of Odin apostrophe S in English, and that reflects what is probably a nominative Wothnas with a Z instead of an S at the end. So we have some predictable sound changes here. W's are always lost before O's and U's in the transition from Proto-Norse to Old Norse. This also explains, as I often bring up these examples, since English keeps those W's, the difference between, say, English worm, Old Norse ormer, English wolf, Old Norse ulver, English word, Old Norse orð, etc. Exact same reason that you have Old English Woden, but Old Norse Odin. All right. But what's surprising here is that the second syllable in the Old Norse word, that I, is not here in Proto-Norse. And as far as I know, no one had actually predicted that was the case. Reconstructions of the Proto-Norse name of Odin had included Wothinas with that I, Wothanas with an A, and part of the uncertainty here was that, of course, unlike in Gestar from Gastis, there's no I mutation. We actually would expect, if this comes from Wothinas with an I in the second syllable like it has in Old Norse, that I would mutate the long O into a long O/, whatever you want to call that vowel. There's no consistent name for it in English. But you'd expect Old Norse Odin, not Odin. What this suggests is that instead it's a two-syllable word in Proto-Germanic, but that last syllable A that's dropped and left that Z to assimilate to the N next to it, you'd expect this to become Old Norse Odin, but that cluster is unacceptable. That I is inserted probably by analogy with the material suffix, the same suffix that becomes modern English en in like golden, wooden. So someone is in the change from Proto-Norse to Old Norse is getting this word somewhere in its, the middle forms here, Wothnas, the Wodens, the Odins, Odin, saying we need a vowel there, and assuming, well, the first part of this is the root woth, mad, so maybe this is like the one made of madness or something like that, and inserting that I. That's why it doesn't cause I mutation, because it's inserted after the period when I mutation was active. We think I mutation probably took effect in the 500, 600, 700. It's somewhere in late Proto-Norse or very, very early Old Norse. So it's interesting that this new Bracteate from Vindelø, Denmark, is showing us that the solution to the problem of Odin's name was different from what anyone had expected. And this reflects, of course, the fact that so little of Proto-Norse is really attested, right? We've got names, right? And some verbs, right? I painted this, I wrote this, that kind of thing, right? It's not an extensive vocabulary. It's not like Old Norse where if you, you can spend all year reading nothing but Old Norse and not read everything that's preserved in Old Norse. Proto-Norse, it's a very different situation. We can't always exactly predict what those earlier name forms are unless we see them in writing. So that's an exciting thing with the that new Bracteate. We know a fair number of the grammatical endings for Proto-Norse, although again we don't have an absolutely complete picture. The endings tend to be very similar to Gothic, a better preserved language from about the same time, also in the Germanic branch, although in fact the Proto-Norse forms look more archaic than the Gothic forms. Gothic has more devoicing, so that Z that's so characteristic of the nominative and some genitives in Proto-Norse and becomes an R in Old Norse is devoiced to an S in Gothic. That reduces some of the apparent complexity of these forms, making some nominatives look like genitives. And there is some, without getting into making this a video about Gothic, Gothic has its own couple sets of changes that make it a little bit different from Proto-Norse, but in general the paradigms are quite similar. This is also true in the verb, where we don't necessarily get a large diversity of verb endings because for the most part the inscribers of inscriptions in Proto-Norse are writing about things they did. So we have the I forms, right, the first person singular forms. So we know, for example, fæhiðó, that is a past tense weak verb. I painted. Since not all inscriptions that this is used of were apparently painted, it is possible that this verb for paint later comes to sort of mean write, right? People just sort of generalize the meaning a little bit, and it's pretty common in semantics. There you can see that we have a long O in that past tense. Long O's in unstressed syllables are going to become A's in Old Norse. So this will be ekfoða in Old Norse, showing also the monophthongization of AIH to a long A. We also see, for example, some present tense are, well, it's a little hard to say what exactly, if it's present tense or past tense, I think, when you see something like waritu on the Jarlsberry stone. That could be some metonymic writing of raitu, which you would expect to be the first person singular past, ekka or ek raitu. I wrote. You can tell that's obviously cognate with English right. In fact, the W is probably somewhat more distinct in the pronunciation of that word in Proto-Norse than I'm making it something like raitu, as distinct from something that didn't have the W, like raitu, perhaps. And we see some adjectives with very similar endings to the nouns and to later Old Norse adjectives, and of course a few prepositions, as you would prepositions, I meant to say pronouns. Of course, the pronoun that you would expect to see the most is the one we see the most, it's I. Some regional variation in this. It looks like the oldest form is eka. That agrees very well with what we would expect for the cognate of Latin or Greek ego, I, right? Later in the West, so in Western Norway and an area settled from it, that A drops and you get ek already in later Proto-Norse. Whereas in the East, in Sweden and Denmark, an area settled from there, the A breaks the E, so-called, and gives us jak, which of course is the ancestor form to Swedish ja, Danish jeg, Norwegian bokmål jeg. We also, I think one of the most interesting things about this new bractate with the earliest form of the name Odin is that it has the pronoun he. And I would not have expected this. The pronoun is the same pronoun for he as in modern High German, right? So it is Proto-Norse is, which is roughly what we would expect the ancestor form to modern High German he to be. So this is a different root for the pronoun than we actually see in Scandinavia later, right? In Old Norse, we expect to see han, which etymologically is basically he, jan, right? It's the same two pieces as we go into those two English words, so, him yonder. This opens up some interesting questions. When was this pronoun replaced in the history of Scandinavia? We don't know. We don't have that many third-person singular pronouns. We know that it's certainly replaced by the 800s, when we start to get Old Norse poetry that's reasonably datable, stuff like Bragi Boddasson's skaldic poems, or the poem on the Ruk runestone. So somewhere in those centuries, the word for he, him, and presumably she, because these are often the same root, are changing in Scandinavia. Why? How? We don't have a good picture of that. But again, a good reminder that our relatively impoverished set of vocabulary in Proto-Norse doesn't get us an absolutely clear picture of the language, even though we can reconstruct it pretty well. There's just stages and steps there that are opaque to us, and we can't exactly predict the mechanisms by which they changed. So syntax is probably the biggest gap in our knowledge of Proto-Norse, as it is in fact with Gothic, given that most of our Gothic material is directly calqued on the Greek of the New Testament from which it's being translated. That means that it's much, much harder for us to anticipate things like word order in Proto-Norse, even relative to Gothic or Old Norse. Consider, for example, I wouldn't have thought he is Odin's man. I wouldn't have thought that possessive Odins would come before man. I would have expected to see it after, like it usually is in Old Norse. So there may have in fact been some conventions and traditions and changes that change one way and then change back, or we're just kind of all over the place. We just can't know about. Well, I hope that has been a reasonable summary of the Proto-Norse language and its differences from Old Norse, and I'll have some resources for you at the end of the screen here. There are a couple I mentioned earlier in the video too. For now, thank you, Patreon, for continuing to make these videos and this lifestyle possible. And from Colorado's beautiful Great Sand Dunes National Park, I'm wishing all of you all the best.